Hello and welcome back to this lesson 8 on module 1, and please note that this is the prerequisite module as you prepare to start your full stack class. And in our previous lesson we have differentiated these three terms: the IP address, port number and the URL. In this particular lesson, let's look at the domain name system and what is a domain name and what is a domain name system. So the domain name is an alias that is used to represent a computer, a specific computer with that an IP address. And the domain name system is now the system that helps us to resolve or to convert the domain names to the IP addresses. For example, 126.2.4 and 6. So when the invention of the World Wide Web came and the invention of the internet came, it becomes necessary that each computer connected to the internet must have a specific number that identifies that computer, and that number is the IP address. And the way we write the IP address is written in this form. We have four numbers which are separated by the decimal numbers, and that means that for you to be able to communicate or send a request to any computer on the internet, you need to know the IP address of that computer. And since numbers are difficult to memorize and to remember, they came up with the domain name. And therefore domain names are more simpler to remember than remembering the numbers. So it's more easy to remember the numbers, the names, than remembering the numbers, and that's why we have the domain names. So if you have a website you want to host on your server, then you have to find the domain name, and then that computer of course will have the physical IP address like this, but on top of that IP address you will have the domain name, so that if users want to reach to your website, instead of using this number, they will use the domain name, for example youtube.com. So if you go to your browser and you type YouTube in your browser, youtube.com, this is the domain name for YouTube. So if you press this, you are able to reach and access the YouTube server. But behind the scenes, that YouTube server has an IP address. So because it is difficult to remember that IP address, we use the domain name. But for us to be able to communicate, that domain name has to be converted to the IP address right from when you enter youtube.com here. This domain name has to be converted to an IP address so that you can get that IP address, and then your client computer can now use that IP address to send the request to the YouTube server. And the thing that helps us to resolve that is the domain name server. So when the user types the domain name in the browser first checks the local storage to see if it knows the IP address of that domain. If no, then the browser then sends the request to the domain name server to resolve it. So the domain name server responds with an IP address of that domain name, and then the browser then makes a second request to that IP address and loads the web page or the website. So this communication works in this architecture. So we have a server somewhere called the domain name server or the domain name system, which has all the records of the servers on the internet, their domain names and their corresponding IP addresses. So when you enter cheetah.com, for example, then that server will convert this into and tell you that the IP address of that domain name is this. Then now your client or browser will now use this this IP address to access that particular website. So the communication diagram represents what we've been talking about. So you have your browser here, and this is the web server where there is a website hosted, and here is the domain name server, which contains all the list of the domains and their corresponding IP addresses. So the first thing that happens when you type the domain name in your browser, before you can even access that website, the first thing the browser does is that it sends the request to the DNS server. The DNS server sends back the response which contains the IP address of that web server. Then the browser uses that IP address to access the website on this web server, right? So that's all about the domain name system and how it works. And that's why when you create a website, you need to host it, and when you're hosting it, you need a domain name to host. So that domain name has to be recorded here on the DNS by the ICANN organization, and then now your domain name will be available publicly to be accessed in any browser. Otherwise, that's all about this particular lesson, and thank you for joining, and see you in the next lesson.